Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Thomas Massaro, Professor of Social Ethics at Weston Jesuit School of Theology. Welcome to this Cambridge Forum featuring Os Guinness discussing his book, Unspeakable, Facing Up to Evil in an Age of Genocide and Terror. Since September 11th, the word evil has re-entered the American popular lexicon after years of disfavor and disuse. American culture now acknowledges evil as a reality of daily life. But how well do we actually understand evil? Is American culture still illiterate when it comes to evil? Our answers to this question drive not only our personal moral decisions, but also have a profound impact on our national politics and even international policies. Are warfare and violence inevitable aspects of the human condition? How can our understanding of evil affect our approaches to conflict resolution? Os Guinness poses this provocative question to modern Americans in his newest book, Unspeakable, Facing Up to Evil in an Age of Genocide and Terror. The author of more than 20 books, including The Call, Invitation to the Classics, and Long Journey Home, Guinness has long been an observer of American culture. A former BBC reporter who was born in China and educated in England, he has lived in the United States since 1984. He is now a speaker and seminar leader, much in demand at political and business conferences in the United States and also in Europe. He has spoken both at the White House and on Capitol Hill, as well as lecturing at many universities, including Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Stanford. Os Guinness, welcome to Cambridge Forum.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege for me to be here in this historic setting and in this tremendous community discussion. As a descendant of a long line of Irish brewers, I am always happy to come back to Boston. And just sorry, it's a little bit before St. Patrick's Day, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Where was God when the tsunami hit? That was the question I was asked on AP radio the day after the tsunami. And it was almost exactly the same question that I was asked after 9/11. Where was God when the tower fell? We're in a soundbite age. But if you'd answered either of those two questions with a soundbite, it would have been considered insulting. Because the fact is that when we raise the questions of suffering and of evil, we are looking in the white of the eye of the greatest mystery of our human existence and the greatest challenge and problem of our modern world. I actually had 9/11 down in my calendar to lead a discussion in Manhattan for Wall Street bankers on the topic of evil. And curiously, the hotel bumped us a week ahead, and we went ahead a week later. And the only other people in the hotel was Sandler and Neil, who'd lost 66 of their colleagues in the tragedy. And one person in the discussion had got down from the 104th floor of the second tower. And that spawned a tremendous discussion in New York and in wider circles. But if you think of it, on the one hand, we have just finished the most murderous century in all human history. On the other hand, we are living in a global era when for the first time in history, all the atrocities, all the natural disasters, we know about them for the first time as they happen. And yet, ironically, many people still have not thought through the problem of evil. Socrates says that the unexamined life is not worth living. If he is right, there are many Americans today living lives not worth living, including many on the best campuses. The double irony, though, is that this country is the one that has the most radical view of evil at its core, in the notion of the separation of powers in the Constitution because of the capacity for the abuse of evil. And yet things that have flowed through this country in the last 200 years, many Americans today have a trivial view of evil, Certainly a hesitant one, a weak one, a confused one. Sometimes it's because of progressive ideas that human beings are essentially good and getting better and better. Sometimes, very differently, it's because of Pollyannaism, particularly in the 1950s, and people plaster life with smiley buttons and rainbows. More recently, for many people, it's because of postmodernism. And I've been on campuses where people have literally argued that it is worse to judge evil than actually to do evil. And bizarre things like that. And you can see in the wake of 9/11, on the one hand, many conservatives supported the president saying, "We have seen the face of evil." But the same people who supported that language when it came to Abu Ghraib were much more reluctant and started to compare this with the things Saddam Hussein had done or whatever, rather than facing the fact that torture, by any standards, certainly by the standards of the declarations we ourselves have signed, is also evil. What I've tried to do in the book, what I hope it accomplishes in some small way, is on the one hand to set out the steps by which individuals can think through evil. And having talked to hundreds, if not thousands of individuals, and also had the privilege of speaking on this in many campuses, what I do in the book is set out 7 steps by which anyone from any background, assuming nothing except that we're human beings together, can really think through the problem of evil in the spirit of Socrates' The Examined Life. On the other hand, my hope is that in the public arena, it will be something of a contribution to the restoration of moral realism and responsibility back in public life, instead of the hesitation and the confusion and divisions of whether we can use the very word evil, often just dismissed as the E word. Let me, in the few minutes we have tonight before the discussion, just set out some of these 7 steps, all very fast and therefore inevitably superficial and somewhat unsatisfactory, but that's what the time of discussion is for. Step 1 in thinking through the problem of evil is recognize the sources. The deepest question of all is unanswerable. Unde malum, whence evil? Where does evil come from? And a full, final answer exactly how evil comes into planet Earth, no one fully knows. But what we do know are the 3 immediate, the approximate sources of evil in our lives. And very obviously, there are either evil or suffering, our bodies, natural disasters, and our fellow human beings. Many Americans are living today as if we're immortal. And there are parts of the country like Los Angeles where there's no autumn, where they almost deny aging and death. But the fact is that our little power-pack bodies are finite and vulnerable and run down. And just as we know entropy in nature and decline and fall in civilizations, so we know very realistically any of us may suffer and all of us will die. As Winston Churchill said after he was knocked down by a car speeding in New York, forgetting which side of the road the traffic was on, "I'm surprised I wasn't squashed like a gooseberry and crushed like an eggshell." But that's what our bodies are and our little minds. Natural disasters hardly need any underscoring in the wake of the tsunami. Sometimes they've been described as nature's terrorists. And if in the face of forces like cancer and leukemia and 100 diseases we feel helpless, how much more so with these incredible natural forces? I was born in China. We lived in a part of China where 20 million died in the Japanese invasion. At one stage, living in Henan, which is the most populous province, we lived in 3 months in a place where 5 million died in 3 months. And my mother was a surgeon, but she said she might have been a ballet dancer or an investment broker for all the use that she could be to people dying all around us, including my 2 brothers. And then there was no food and there was no medicine. But the third force is the one we need to take most seriously, because the 20th century truly was the most murderous. Beginning with the Armenian genocide in World War I, through the Ukraine terror famine, Auschwitz and the death camps, the Gulag Archipelago, The Cultural Revolution, in which 65 million may have been killed in China under Mao Zedong. Pol Pot and the killing fields, right down to Rwanda and Sudan, and today the Congo. The most murderous century in all human history, raising the simple question, what does it say of us that the people who did these things are the same species we are? Step 2 in thinking it through is listen to the questions. Both suffering and evil are very unique. But at the same time, you can see, if you listen to those hurt by the anguish and outrage of either extreme suffering or terrible evil, certain deep human questions are squeezed out of the heart and the mind almost instinctively, irrepressibly. And they're the questions that later have to be answered. 3 predominate. Why me? Suddenly something happens which seems so random that life appears like a great lottery. Why me, or why not me? The second deep question, where's God? Someone must be held accountable for something so irrational, so outrageously wrong. The buck must stop somewhere. And we can all think of the great atheists who've cried out skeptically against God, even not believing in God. Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, if there's a God, he's the devil. Stendhal, the only excuse for God is he doesn't exist. And various people recently, in the wake of the tsunami, Barbara Ehrenreich, God owes us an apology. But we should equally remember it's also a cry of faith in time of anguish. Supremely, Jesus of Nazareth on the cross, as many remembered in the Passion. My God, why have you forsaken me? The moment of deepest anguish, one feels alone, and someone must be held responsible. And the third great question, how can I stand it? On the surface, the most practical. The need to get through the night, to get through the suffering, to get through the pain. But actually also the most philosophical, because as Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. And it's very sobering to see how many of the great atheists who went through Auschwitz took their lives afterwards, because at the end of the day, some of them, like Primo Levi, nearly 50 years later, finally they had no why, and the horror of the darkness overwhelmed them. Step 3 in thinking it through. Acknowledge the modern transformations. The modern world has transformed our human experience at point after point after point, many of them in wonderful ways, such as medicine and health. And certainly the modern world, by which I mean the whole world since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, has transformed our capacity and experience of evil in ways we need to recognize. The first way is actually good, but with a downside. The modern world has minimized pain. The rise of anesthetics, the discovery of aspirin, and who would quarrel with those? But now for the first time, many adults in the modern world, particularly the Western world, can live all their adult lives without pain, which is wonderful. Except it does lead to the downside of a lack of realism about suffering in life, and the simple fact is that any of us may suffer, and all of us will die. But the second and third transformations are not so benign. The second is that the modern world has magnified destructiveness, not as many people think through weapons of mass destruction, but rather through our modern processes and attitudes of thinking and bureaucracy, a division of labor, a diffusion of responsibility. The famous discussion of Hannah Arendt about the banality of evil, by which she did not mean that evil was not monstrously evil, and that there were monsters like Hitler and Himmler behind it, but that many people like Eichmann were actually functionaries, hardly aware of the full amount of what they were doing. And the sobering fact is in the 20th century that most evil was done by relatively, quote, good, ordinary people who did not have evil in mind, who were not strikingly aware of the terrible evil consequences of what they were doing, but they were just following orders, or going along with the officialese and the bureaucratic speak and so on. And as the famous Stanley Milgram experiments in New Haven pointed out, the same attitudes could be found in Americans in a liberal university town. The third great transformation, the modern world has marginalized traditional categories of responding to evil, not just words like good and evil, but also people who are in the forefront of responding, like priests and ministers, replaced by grief counselors and many others today. And you can see how many people, because of these forces, have just become, as I said, hesitant and confused about using the word. I myself think that as we look at the murderousness of our times, it's not that we're more evil. It's just that we're more modern. And the irony is that we're the most humanitarian generation. We have saved more people in the 20th century than ever before. At the same time, we have slaughtered more people than ever before. And both, sadly, are true. The fourth step is the deepest. Assess the different interpretations. What's quite clear when you get down to the heart of the discussion of evil, that the natural sciences don't give us answers. You can't weigh or measure or calculate evil. And in fact, you have to go back to the deepest answers which raise philosophical and religious dimensions in answering them. As I see it, rather than the sloppy modern idea that all the different faiths and philosophies are the same, and if we were only nice to each other and talked long enough, we'd get down to the common core and we'd all agree. The fact is that there are great differences between the great families of faiths, and those differences make a difference not only for individuals, but also for whole civilizations. Obviously, I haven't time to get into it in any depth at all, but let me just say very briefly, the first great family of faiths is the Eastern. Hinduism, Buddhism, and varieties of the New Age movement today. The second great family of faiths is the secularist. Atheists, agnostics, naturalists, materialists. And their view of the universe, of course, goes back to chance. The third great family of faiths in the West includes Judaism and the Christian faith, where you begin the whole understanding with a personal and transcendent God. Let me just point out one difference, very radical difference, between the three, and then a difference that it makes. Although the East and the secularist answers are very different, they actually have one common link, that in both the Eastern answers and the secularist answer, evil is something natural and normal and integral to the world as it is, what the Buddhists call dukkha, and so on. Now in the East, since evil is normal and natural, there is a renunciation and detachment and withdrawal. And there is no vision of a world beyond evil. The secularist answer in some ways is the opposite. Evil is natural and normal and integral, so engage with it and fight it. But the commonality is that the fight is forlorn. I've had the privilege, when I was an undergraduate, of knowing Bertrand Russell. Later, when I was at Oxford, of knowing Professor Alfred Sir A.J. Eyre. Magnificent atheists. I've read many of the great atheists like Dawkins and Albert Camus and so on. Read any of them. The long-term prospects, as Russell says, are the firm foundations of unyielding despair. Or as Camus says, because evil is normal and natural, the plague in the world, you face, quote, never-ending defeat. The clearest statement of both by an atheist who thought himself through to a position inches from Buddhism was the German philosopher Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer puts it very bluntly. The world should never have been. Existence itself is the problem. The crime, he said, is the crime of being born. The error is the error of existence. Now, the Jewish and Christian answers have a very different answer. Not the world should never have been, but, as George Steiner, the great Jewish literary critic, puts it, the world should have been otherwise. There once was a time when it was different, and there will be a time again when it will be different. But something has gone badly awry. So as Steiner points out, and the whole biblical witness underscores, when we feel grief at something so tragically wrong, or outrage against the violation of it, we're actually feeling the very way that God himself feels. And that's only the beginning of the differences. But you can see flowing out of that is in the Western culture a tradition of reforms unmatched by any other civilization in history. As Augustine put it, and as Martin Luther King echoed many years later, whenever an unjust practice or an unjust law in society is contradicted by the just law of God, there is a reform to be done, ranging from the banning of infanticide in the 1st century, down to the abolition of slavery in the 18th century, down to civil rights in the 20th century. I haven't time to describe the other steps in it. Step 5 is to take the appropriate action, to confront evil and to comfort those in suffering. Step 6 is to say no to false accountings. Because when people are truly hurting, they want to know why and grasp on to false explanations. And often they end up with explanations that are actually cruel and insensitive. And often we simply do not know why certain things are happening. The last step is to appreciate the silver linings in evil. They are not the purpose of evil. They are not the explanation of evil. But even in the most horrendous evil and suffering, you can see, as many have pointed out gently, deep silver linings which give it some redeeming value, even in the midst of the darkness of the horror. But let me just finish before throwing it open to you for discussion with this, which in some ways, to many of us who take life seriously in Socrates' examined way, and many of us who respond to suffering and evil with faith. To anyone who does, the deepest question of all was the question raised after Auschwitz, what? And it's been said after Auschwitz, there can be no beauty in poetry. After Auschwitz, there can be no love and meaning in human relationships. And above all, after Auschwitz, there can be no God. How do we answer that? The best answer, I think, comes from one of the survivors of Auschwitz, Viktor Frankl. Not in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, but his posthumous book, less well known, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Frankl just says quietly, those who say that were actually not in Auschwitz. As a survivor, he says very simply, I can say that more people deepened their faith or discovered faith in the horror of the death camps than lost it. And the story of many like Jean Amery and Primo Levi and others who were atheists, Jean Amery acknowledges that the intellectuals were less able to handle desperate dark evil than many ordinary people. And Frankl finished his response with a beautiful little picture. He said, an inadequate faith is like a small fire, which when a small breeze comes, it will quickly blow it out. But he said a genuine faith, a true faith that has looked suffering in the white of the eye and still has realism and still has hope and still has courage. A genuine faith, he said, is like a strong fire, which, when a strong wind comes along, it will only blow it into an inextinguishable blaze. And that's certainly been my experience of talking to many who've been in dark situations. And I'll always remember my own mother describing the horror of those 3 months and the 5 million dying, including my 2 brothers. I nearly died, she nearly died, my father nearly died. And she said it was actually in the nightmare of that reality that her faith truly became unmistakably real. And in my experience, evil, far from being the rock of atheism, as it's sometimes put, is in fact quite a stumbling block to many of the great atheists today, and a doorway to a deeply examined life and to a genuine faith.
You're joining us at the Cambridge Forum, listening to Os Guinness addressing the topic, Facing Up to Evil in the 21st Century. Allow me to pose the first question. It's a very serious book. The only time when I laughed out loud while reading the book was early on when you quote this statement from Professor Jean Bethke-Elshtain. And here's the quote. What we need is a Reinhold Niebuhr, but what we get are 50 Dr. Joyce brothers. You may have to explain Reinhold Niebuhr. I think most of us know Dr. Joyce brothers. Can you explain the force of that quotation?
You can look at American thinking in the last 100 years, and you can see how the old Puritan view, which is so common here in New England, of a radical view of the capacity for human evil, has slowly shifted from evil defined as crime before the law to sickness defined by psychiatrists down to the hole in the soul, low self-esteem, and so on. And I think a great deal of American popular psychology today has incredibly trivial views of evil. And you had an example of that, or people realizing that was inadequate, in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, where you had an argument among psychiatrists saying, can we use the E word? And some of them, certainly the minority, were saying there is some types of evil, say Ted Bundy and the predatory killing, that is so calculated in its monstrosity and so horrific in its outcomes and its sadism and so on, that you have to go beyond the word disturbed or the word dysfunctional and use a word that is morally charged, such as evil. Now, I would expand on that, Father Tom, by saying the same thing is true of postmodernism generally. Many people today had got to the point where everything's relative, where you're coming from, following Nietzsche, cultural relativism, and so on. And yet when they come face to face with genuine evil, they instinctively know it's so evil you have to suspend relativism and cultural sophistication and say, this is evil. As Winston Churchill used to say, the best argument for God is Hitler, for whom a hell is necessary. In other words, there's some things the human heart knows instinctively are so wrong that you need to transcend mere relativism. And I think that's what Jean Elshtain was after.
You're listening to Os Guinness discussing Facing Up to Evil in the 21st Century. Let's take our first question.
Yes, you said in step 4, you said you can't measure, weigh, or calculate evil. How is this possible? I mean, clearly, when September 11 happened, when 3,000 people lost their lives, the magnitude of that tragedy was far more evil than, say, the Madrid train bombings, where only 160 or so died. So please clarify your meaning.
No, what I meant was the evil itself. You can't tell me what the color is, or if it weighs so many pounds, or whatever. There's an intangible force, yes. But equally, as people have recognized, there's a danger in only viewing it statistically. You know, Stalin said, counting on that fact, you know, the death of one person is a tragedy. The death of 1 million people is a statistic. And when you merely quantify it, you get up to numbers which are almost impossible for the heart to get itself round, let alone the mind to. So, no, of course, you can assess levels of evil, of course. Absolutely. And that wasn't what I was saying. I'm just saying you can't measure it. You can't put it into a test tube and see it. It doesn't have a certain color gas or something like that. That's what I was trying to say.
You can't analyze it, is what you mean.
Yes, in that way.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are humans the only species that do evil?
Like this, anything like this. What Nietzsche discussed it as an atheist. He says, we are the only species that indulge in what he calls the festival of cruelty, quite like this. So, you know, when Rwanda happened, you saw that incredibly, the fastest massacre in the 20th century. Many people used the word bestial, and others gently pointed out, wait a minute, the animals, the beasts, they don't behave like that. Only human beings behave quite like this.
Yeah, my question is, after us in Europe use the genocidal weapon evil of mass destruction of the embargo against Iraq and Afghanistan Talibans because whatever, and kill over 1 million women and children and men. Why the big media connected the Islamic Jewish law of an eye for an eye? They might have that being a motive to retaliate against the bombing of the towers, killing thousands of men, women, and children too. What do you think of that? Why the big media, they never connected that, calling us saints and they evil, but we started that. We killed them first, the kids and the women.
I didn't have a chance to get into the responses to evil, and they obviously differ according to the different worldviews, but the first part of a response coming from the biblical family of faiths is what you might call moral realism and responsibility. In other words, whatever evil is out there in the world, I too have the capacity for evil in my heart. You have the famous story of the Catholic journalist G.K. Chesterton when the London Times asked a lot of intellectuals what's wrong with the world. He, instead of an essay, he wrote back a postcard. He simply put on 2 words, I am. Now, but here's the point coming to what you're saying. The danger in dealing with evil is people who are virtuous falling for dualism. In other words, if they're evil and I'm virtuous and believe in freedom and so on, you're evil, I'm good. And as soon as you think like that, the danger, I don't mean you, any of us do, the danger comes of hypocrisy. And always nations that take virtue seriously are more vulnerable to hypocrisy.
So what's your solution?
Well, it's the realism. But let me give the example first. The British and the Americans both take virtue seriously. We are much more liable to hypocrisy than the French and the Italians, who are much more cynical about things like that. And you can see, bring it home to America. It's often said about Americans, and Lance Morrow has this in his book, Americans never like to face up to their own evil. So take a simple example. With the rise of just war theory, one of the elements of just war theory is a distinction between the combatants, the soldiers, the military, and civilians. It's evil to cross that line, unjust. It began heavily in World War I with the blockade of Germany, and then picked up in World War II with the Allied carpet bombing, Dresden, Cologne, and the firebombing of Tokyo. And now it's almost routine, and we have in America words like collateral damage. So 100,000 Iraqi civilians die, we don't count them. We see through them and just put it in the category collateral damage. That, by just war terms, is unjust and evil, and an example of the dualism creeping in. Because we're fighting in the name of democracy and freedom, and they're bad, we must be good. And even Nietzsche warned of those who seek to destroy monsters and in the process become monsters themselves. And it's people who fight for justice who really have to watch that the means they use are held within just bounds. Thank you.
So we created a terrorist against us, if you agree with me.
We have to watch things like that.
So I'm a biologist, and I have several strains of bacteria, one of which itself, a few percent of the population commits suicide routinely for the purpose of producing a toxin which kills close relatives but not those immediately related to them. And I've been trying to think through this, whether that altruistic effort on the behalf of its closest relatives is actually something that we would consider as evil or not. And I wanted to hear your take on that.
I honestly don't know the individual circumstances. You'd have to look at them in detail. But when you see today, for instance, we're in a culture that's increasingly welcoming euthanasia and putting people to death who are terminally ill. And in Holland, where the experiments advance most, you have the most strong versions of what's called over there a culture of death. And one of the Dutch parliamentarians was in the British Parliament last year and admitted probably 25% of those who suffer euthanasia in Holland are put to death against their will now by their families. Now, there's no question that if you look in history, there's a direct link between low views, one, of humanity, and two, of human life in general and the ease with which we take people's life at the end of their life or the beginning of life. So that's what I would ask for. In other words, it is not altruistic to commit suicide. And in the Jewish and Christian understanding, where every human being has a precious and innate dignity, we leave ourselves and our lives in God's hands and don't take our own lives. And you'll see very clearly as this discussion widens, the culture of death with voices like Nietzsche and people like Ayn Rand who are against genuine altruism and view it just as a form of empty hypocrisy, we're moving down towards a world where euthanasia and killing people will become more normal. And it will be a very sad world that we'll reap. But you'd have to look at the individual circumstances of what you're saying. Thank you.
Good evening. I was wondering whether you thought America might need a Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And second, who's most inspirational to you as a mentor and a teacher? Who has been in your life? Who's in your life today as your mentor?
There's a lot of areas where we need courageous voices. I hope we don't need a Dietrich Bonhoeffer yet. We need, back to Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a tremendous voice for moral realism, in the 30s and the 40s. I hope we don't get to the stage where we need a Bonhoeffer and it's that extreme. But we do need in a lot of areas independent voices of tremendous courage. I remember just before the impeachment, I happened to have the privilege of a series of meals with some of the leading intellectuals in Washington. And I asked each of them, who do you think is the national leader now who has the courage, the vision, the sense of American history, and of course the access to the mic or the camera, who will speak out? And I was struck in the course of 2 weeks asking about 20 of them, many of whose names you'd know well, not one of them could say one. And there's a lot of issues, for instance, the culture warring issue, on which America needs someone of Lincoln-like stature to stand above the fray, in the case of the culture wars, to say, in effect, a pox on both your houses, and to articulate a better way. So that's certainly a cry. Your second question, mentors. I have many, past and present, I have many heroes who are dead. One of my great heroes is a friend of Arthur Guinness. My great-great-grandfather founded the brewery, and that was William Wilberforce, the great leader of the abolition movement. But I love thinkers like Augustine or Pascal and many others like that. In terms of people who are alive today, my mentor in the social sciences is Peter Berger, who's down the road here at Boston University. And I found, as a student and a graduate student, his thinking was the most fresh and fertile, comprehensive, creative thinking that I'd come across. And I still find him deeply, deeply stimulating.
Thank you.
There was no discussion of the United States, that the United States acted evil after dropping the atomic bomb on the two Japanese cities. Do you feel that that was an act of evil, considering that they firebombed the...
Well, let's take a simpler example, because I know and you know the arguments that surround that one. I didn't actually mention Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I was talking about the bombing of Tokyo, which followed on directly from the Allied bombing of Cologne and Dresden 60 years ago. Robert McNamara, if you've seen his recent documentary Fog of War, he admits that if the United States had lost the war, he and General Curtis LeMay would have been tried as war criminals for what they did, bombing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Tokyo. I'm not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the long time of the firebombing of those cities, and he himself admitted that by just war standards it was unjust and wrong, and he would have been a war criminal if the Allies had lost.
My father is 92 years old now, still alive over in Scotland, and he was in the World War II. And he was witness to seeing his ship being bombed by the Germans and the people that he served with being set fire to in amongst all the oil on the harbour. And at that point he he didn't dwell on that, but he did say to me at one point that he did see evil in that. And he made a choice at that point to live his life doing as much good for others than he possibly could. And he has always stood up for what he believed was right. And he has always turned round and said, whatever is lovely, whatever is good, I will think on these things. It wasn't that he was wishy-washy, but he confronted evil and turned round with love. I want your reflection on that, whether we can stand in the face of evil and turn round and say, you're not going to win because we're going to turn round with love.
Absolutely. I love the little line by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his Nobel address. He's talking about Soviet lies and propaganda and violence, and the crucial line he says, let the lie enter the world, let the lie even dominate the world, but not through me. In other words, at the end of the day, each of us is responsible for our own small circles of influence, and that's where we're responsible. Evil can happen anywhere. Evil's happened in all sorts of places, but each of us can stake out a place where we say, no, in my part of the world, I will comfort the sufferer. I will stand against the person who's unjust or oppressive or whatever. And of course the temptation is to think of the great monstrous evils like Auschwitz and so on. And there is between the monstrous evils and what you might call the daily and domestic forms of violence and spouse battering and so on, there's a huge mid-level belt. For instance, there are more people in slavery today than at the time of the Middle Passage. If International Justice Mission hadn't stepped in after the tsunami, thousands of the children orphaned were going to be taken to the brothels to serve people under the age of 10. And so on. There's a huge mid-level belt of terrible injustice and oppression all around the world. And thank God for everyone who's saying, but not through me. In the areas in which we're responsible, we make a stand. We make sure our voices, our money, our vote, or whatever it is, raises those issues and makes a difference. Thank you.
One of the problems with evil, you mentioned, of course, Auschwitz on many occasions here, saying that after Auschwitz there can be no poetry and, reciting some of those famous observations. A cynic might say that after Auschwitz there can be no Palestine. And what we've seen is some disturbing parallels between the ways that Israelis treat Palestinians and the way that they were treated in Europe. And Palestinian psychologists have also noted among their own children that they have fantasies of being strong, overpowering Israeli gods with their foot on the necks of victims and so forth. Do you feel that evil can be self-replicating in the sense that victims have an overwhelming thirst to go on to become victimizers, even though they don't conceive of themselves as such, and that once former victims become victimizers, it's difficult for others to say anything much about that due to the complicated intertwining of those two strands of experience?
No, you're pointing out a terrible potential. The best person I know on this is Zygmunt Bauman, who is a great social scientist in Europe. He is Jewish. His wife was a survivor of Auschwitz, and he argues that a false playing of the victim card, and particularly what he calls the aristocracy of victimhood, people all claiming they're descendants of victims, and many of them have no relation to it, that is Hitler's posthumous triumph. And he warns not only against victimization, he also warns against the cult of the survivor. And you can see whether it's social Darwinism or modern American reality shows like Survivor. The idea that surviving at all costs is the thing is a very dangerous idea. And Bauman has a very radical critique of the false responses to evil, of which the notion of survivor, the notion of victim, or the notion of the suicide bomber and the self-professed martyr are all terrible examples. So the response to evil is a very important one. One of the most controversial areas where the response is discussed is the question of forgiveness. And in the biblical family of faiths, you have a fascinating argument between Jews and Christians. Some of you may have read Simon Wiesenthal's The Sunflower, where he tells this extraordinary story of being taken in to meeting a dying Nazi, and the Nazi asking him if he'll listen to his confession. And Wiesenthal turns on his heels and walks out, and he says, "What could I have done? What should I have done? What would you have done?" And he puts this to 50 people. And to a person, every one of the famous Jews who's asked the question says, "You did the right thing. You must never forgive." Even God, they say, does not forgive the murderer. Only the victim can, and the victim's gone. And there's quite a chilling quality in the discussion on that side. The Christians say, yes, you should forgive, and the ethic of Jesus to forgive without limit is not some sentimental thing, it's actually a radical thing. And the most telling are Martin Marty, the historian, and Desmond Tutu. And they point out only forgiveness breaks the terrible cycle of evil in the past, Corsican blood feud or whatever, and breaks that for the future and opens up a liberated new future. And the best public example of that is the so-called South African miracle, and Nelson Mandela's forgiving rather than seeking revenge on his captors when he got off Robben Island. So false ways of responding and proper ways of responding are really at the heart of the discussion of evil.
In a local business school ethics discussion, none of the students could come up with a single ethical point that they were in unanimity about. And in the absence of unanimity, they were unwilling to say that anything could be enforced. With that kind of a relativistic mindset, how do you teach whether there is good or evil? Or are we stuck with, as Menninger said in the 70s, what is legal and illegal?
Well, fortunately, our schools, high schools and so on, are not run by kids. They're run for kids. So when this discussion came up, for instance, the state of Maryland a number of years ago, in the light of all the cultural relativism and all the pluralism of faiths, Southern California school with 98 religions in one school. What does that mean for ethics? What they did in Maryland was get together representatives of all the different groups and say, now, what are the values you care about? And they discovered what John Rawls here at Harvard called an overlapping consensus. In other words, there were things like honesty, patriotism, loyalty, etc., etc., that whether you were an atheist or a Jew or a Christian or a Jehovah's Witness or a Scientologist or a Muslim, Buddhist or whatever, they all believed in. They got down to about 12. And in Maryland, they reckoned the business of the public school is to teach the common core values in their results, how honesty works out in practice ethically, but not the business of the schools to teach the roots. That's the business of the faith community and the family at home. So Christians shouldn't expect the public schools to say the Bible says X, Y, and Z. That's the business of the church, the synagogue, the family. The public schools can teach the outworking of why honesty matters in all sorts of ways. So fortunately, while there is a really acidic relativism at some levels of society, at the more responsible levels, it hasn't gone quite that far.
Two quick questions. First, in your years of thinking about evil in your work, have you ever found yourself that you lost faith in humanity or perhaps in God when facing evil in humanity or in yourself or in people that you love in acknowledging it? And the second question is, do you personally believe that humanity will ever get past genocide? Not just can we potentially turn around with love or forgiveness, but do you believe that we ever will get past it?
Good question. Everything that I've experienced myself or heard from my parents, and I just described a little bit of what we saw in China, or have read about or heard other people account for, to me underscores actually what the biblical family of faith says about human nature, that there's a paradox, there's a contradiction. Human beings have a greatness, a nobility, a creativity, a capacity for love, which is stupendous. And yet at the same time, this horrifying capacity for evil, and both are true. And of course the question is, if that's so, which faith or worldview explains not one or the other, but both? But that's another discussion. So that would be one answer to what you're saying. Now remind me what the second part of the question was.
Do you believe humanity will get past it?
Oh, they passed it. The essence of progressivism, following from the Enlightenment, is that we're essentially good, and if there are problems, it's in the system, Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains, as Rousseau said, or it's with a little better education. People like John Dewey were in that direction, or improved psychology, and so on. I personally don't think any of those will really get down to it. And one of the stories I find so moving is the story of W.H. Auden, the poet. He was an agnostic and a socialist and a broad liberal, came to Manhattan in 1939 to escape Nazi-dominated Europe. And he tried to follow what was happening in Europe by keeping up the documentaries. There was no television in those days. And he went to the cinema every weekend. And one weekend, 2 months after the war broke out, he saw a documentary on the siege of Poland. The Nazi stormtroopers going in, bayoneting women and children. And unbeknownst to him, the audience, this is Yorkville, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, was broadly German. He didn't realize that. It was a German-speaking audience in that time. And the German audience cried out, kill them, egging on the stormtroopers. And Auden describes this 5-minute about turn in his mind and heart. He said, I've always thought we were essentially good. He said, I looked at that and I knew human beings were radically evil, and I include myself. Then he said, of course, I was stuck. As a European intellectual, I'd spent all my life saying, there are no absolutes, everything's relative. But he said, I knew this was absolutely evil, and I needed something on which to be able to say it, and then to attack it. And Auden was like many people whose views of progressive human nature, getting better and better, with a bit of better psychology, education, politics, whatever, was just totally falsified. Another one in World War II was William Golding. If you read Lord of the Flies and things like that. In other words, his view of human nature, not really all that bad, was just fundamentally falsified by the reality of evil when he saw it. Yes, sir.
How you doing? Is this damn thing on? I don't need it anyways. It's great hearing you. When I saw your name today, Guinness, I wasn't sure if that was a name because it's just an unusual name, O-Z. I'm glad no Guinness was here, because if I drink too much Guinness, I'm evil. But anyways, no offense to Guinness. But anyways, I think of the word evil, and I think if I spell the word evil backwards, it spells live. And I think about that because I think evil is as natural as living. You know, because we all can choose to be evil. Like, it's good. I can choose to be good, I can choose to be evil. And then when you're talking about God, I think of it, spell it backwards, and it's like dog. I hear people talk about God, and you almost think that God was their pet dog, because they're talking, got the God pretty well trained. And I think when we were talking about Socrates, about looking at ourselves, I can say I'm evil, but I'm also good, because I have to look deep in my soul and recognize my fears and not build off of them. So my question to you is evil a choice? Can I be as evil as I choose to be? Like, if I choose to be good, I choose to be good, but I can choose to be evil too.
Evil obviously is very strongly a choice. The old definition of evil was relatively simple and straightforward. Evil was the intent to do harm. If it was a murder case, malice, aforethought. But 20th century evil was so powerful and so elusive and mysterious to understand that the traditional answer was seen not to be enough. Because on the one hand, you can't always clarify and analyze that intent to do harm. And on the other hand, in the 20th century evil, many of the worst evils, as I said, were done by people who didn't intend to do evil. It was the terrible consequences of what they did. So, yes, evil is very definitely rooted to choice. The thing I would have challenged you at the beginning, you said evil is just natural. Now, I don't know how seriously you took that position, because if you take it in the Eastern direction, or in the secularist direction, if evil is natural and normal to the world, then you have no hope of ever overcoming it. And you usually end up in one of the fatalistic resignation positions or withdrawal and renunciation. In the Jewish and Christian view, evil is natural after the fall. But there once was a time when it wasn't here, and there will be a time again when it will not be here. It is not natural to the world, otherwise you eventually will resign yourself to it, which actually leads to a very sad position.
Why do you think 20th century evil was so much worse than the evil that had come in all of those centuries before? That's one question. The other one is a little harder to articulate. But you obviously have a very strong streak of idealism, and you bring up Martin Luther King and Reinhold Niebuhr and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and looking for a new Lincoln to bestride the culture wars. On the other hand, you warn us very strongly against the danger of virtue and being enthralled to the idea of virtue in a dualistic system. How do you reconcile that distrust of the idea of virtue with your idealism?
I like to think that I'm as realistic as I'm idealistic. My wife would probably tell you more realistically which is the dominant one. But I think a Jewish and Christian biblical position is both. It's idealistic, and it's because you have a possibility of justice and a world beyond tears and so on. At the same time, it's very realistic because of its fundamental view of evil and sin in the human heart. So it's a combination of both. I mentioned the danger of dualism because of virtue, because that's really our kind of Western problem. If you look at it in a bigger picture, there's one thing even more dangerous, which is Utopianism. And most of the great 20th century evils were done in the name of Utopianism. Even Hitler, whom we think of as monstrously evil because of his treatment of the Jews, actually had strong utopian strands in his thinking. And certainly Mao Zedong and Pol Pot did in their communist ideologies. So the greatest danger is beware utopianism. But we who are Western have to say beware dualism, which is the problem of those who take virtue seriously. I'm not warning against virtue, but warning against the point that Jesus made. You have a beam in your own eye and all you see is the splinter in your brother's eye, which is the great danger. Now, is the 20th century murderousness. Auschwitz is often taken as the epitome. Now, as we know, only 6 million died in the German extermination camps, Jews, Gypsies, and others, compared with Mao Zedong's 65, or Stalin's 30 or 40, whatever the final numbers proved to be. Auschwitz, on the one hand, we know much more about it than we do about Stalin. The Russians haven't opened up their evidence to look at it the way the Germans have after World War II. The Chinese are a long way from acknowledging some of these things ever happened. I do follow people like Zygmunt Bauman, who says, we tend to say, that was the 1930s, that was a German problem, and it's gone. Here we are, 70-odd years later, and so on. And he says, no. The processes that made it so powerful and natural, written into bureaucracy, etc., are the modern processes today. And so we've got to be aware, because we have these processes too. I gave the casualties. Relatively small example, quotes, of collateral damage. And we've got to be constantly vigilant that these things don't happen all over again in greater or lesser ways in the name of things like freedom. So we never get beyond the capacity of evil. A great book by Denis de Rougemont, who in many ways is the Roman Catholic C.S. Lewis, not as well known as C.S. Lewis, the French C.S. Lewis. He has a great book on the devil, and his main point is that evil is something that's constantly surprising you. Just when you think Hitler's the worst thing you can ever imagine, you discover it pops out in democratic form, or whatever. It's a very mysterious, dark, elusive force. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. Do you recall, or can you share, possibly a conversation with Bertrand Russell that was formative in your thinking about this problem? And secondly, you ended with a sort of affirmation of faith. It seems to me that's what I took away from your closing remarks. And personally, I find that troubling in the sense that religious communities are also corrupt. There have been crusades, there have been religious fatwas and just war theories devised to explain evil acts, even within religious communities. And how do you fit those into your scheme of thinking?
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. Russell used to come in the 1960s. He was the leading campaigner against nuclear warfare. And a lot of his speeches were on that. But I found him most interesting when he was talking about his book, The Free Man's Worship, and describing what he came to in 1903 when he wrote that, and where he was in the 1960s with that. And he was undoubtedly incredibly noble. I mean, you looked at his face, and it had a sort of aquiline nobility looking out over the prospect of a nuclear abyss, and yet tackling it with courage. And yet you listen to him, bleak, 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 and cold. And when he says in A Free Man's Worship, we're united by the tie of a common doom, or the only foundation, or the firm foundations of unyielding despair, and so on, there is a relentless bleakness about him, which is admirable, because many atheists I know in Washington, they're kind of suburban atheists. Atheism is the ideology of living life how you like it, not thinking about anything really. But Russell starts with the beginning of the universe, and he thinks through what he sees as ultimate extinction, and he probably would have agreed with what Sartre said. Many years after Russell died, Sartre said, atheism is a cruel long-term business. I've thought it through to the end. Now, you raise another huge question. Such is the power and preciousness of faith that it is very open to distortion and manipulation. But let's look at it more dispassionately. For instance, you mentioned, and you didn't make a big point of it, your point was fair. Many people say, faith? Inquisition and Crusades. Those things were done by people in the name of Jesus Christ, and they were profoundly evil, and they happened. And everyone who has faith in Jesus would have to acknowledge, sadly, that those things did happen, and they were outrageously evil. But start thinking for a minute. More people were killed by secularist regimes in the 20th century than by all the religious persecutions in Western history combined, by secularist regimes led by secularist intellectuals in the name of secularist ideologies. And hardly ever does that come into public discussion. Absolutely bizarre. People will get fixated on the Inquisition and not mention the 100 million killed under communism, for starters. In other words, there's an incredible imbalance and lack of humility and lack of honesty in much of the discussion. I don't mean your question is a good question. So you take things, say, currently one of the big debating points is monotheism, the idea of a belief in one true God. So just down the road in 1992, a famous lecture by Gore Vidal, monotheism is the great unmentionable evil at the heart of our culture. And it was a broadside attack on Judaism, Christian faith, and Islam, widely echoed. Book currently out called God Against the Gods, interestingly, by a Jew, almost you could say Jews against Judaism. In fact, though, the much more dispassionate analysis of monotheism, like Rodney Stark in his two great books, points out monotheism is the most influential and innovative belief in human history. And to it we owe such things as science, etc., etc., etc. And there isn't a good discussion on a lot of this that's genuinely fair. There's a great deal of prejudice and quick thinking that doesn't get into it. So any faith, sadly, or any ideology can be terribly abused. And I would be the first to say if faith is abused. For instance, for me as a follower of Jesus, the greatest statement of monotheism in expanded form in the Bible is the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem. But quite unlike what Gore Vidal and others are talking like, in the prophet Isaiah, when you have the vision of one true God, how does he come? What's his agency? First, it's the birth of a baby. Secondly, it's through a servant who's prepared to be hideously tortured and disfigured in order to do God's will, suffering on behalf of God. There's no triumphalism, let alone coercion. And the idea that Constantine or the evils of the Crusades flow from the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, I find it absolutely obscene. But these things can be terribly distorted, and I think those of us who have an integrity to our faith should be the first to stand against such distortions.
Early in the book you say, modern people have a chronic inability to name and to judge evil. Later you say, September 11th caught the United States unprepared intellectually and morally. What's going on here? How can we get better prepared?
I believe, although I wasn't up here, that Harvard University was a good example, Harvard College. When the president made his remarks that we have seen the face of evil, many of the students said that's exactly right, the undergraduates. But many of the professors say you can't talk like that. Such moral judgmentalism is closer to Sunday school lessons and old Western films than it is to serious academic discussion. Now, I was intrigued that the very people who supported the president said 9/11 was evil, period. When it came to Abu Ghraib, they were much more equivocal. And all the excuses that Republican senators made about the release and fraternity antics and we weren't as bad as Saddam Hussein completely missed the point. We judge ourselves not by the standards of some of the worst, but by our own standards, let alone those who are complaining about Michael Newdow removing under God. It was funny that when they actually came down to it, they didn't consider Abu Ghraib under God. And clearly they were a long way from Thomas Jefferson even, who was prepared to talk about under God and trembling about slavery, although we might say he didn't tremble long enough. So you can see an incredible lack of realism. And I think we need to restore tough moral thinking. If you look at ethics, I'm told, the Hastings Center points out, there's something like 12,000 new ethics courses in the last 15 years. Across American universities, colleges, business schools, and so on. 12,000. You'd think this is fabulous. Great new ethical understanding. Much of it's what's called prevention ethics, not principled ethics. In other words, you want to keep your name out of the headlines. You want to keep yourself out of the law courts. So compliance, the things you don't do so that you're not sued. But that's not ethics. Or a great deal of it is social ethics on the environment and various important things, not individual ethics, and so on, and there are many reasons. But much of it is that a great deal of the discussion of ethics is about how to discuss ethics, not actually what it is to be a right person or a good person and to do things that are right and good. And for all the explosions of ethics courses in America, we are truly still in a deep crisis ethically. And it comes out in things like Enron and WellCom and so on, and will continue until, presumably this is what you teach, Father Tom, until we have better teaching like Father Tom does every week.
You also say in your book, any good answer to the challenge of evil should have three things: realism, courage, and hope. You've talked about one or two of those. Would you want to just round out our understanding of those three?
Well, that idea went back to a speech by Ernest Lustig, if you know him, an eminent professor of literature at American University. And he was a survivor of Auschwitz. And on the 50th anniversary of the liberation 10 years ago, he gave a very moving meditation on NPR. And if I've got it right, he said, I wish everyone in America today could have a 60-second peek into the real thing. In other words, not today's museum, like the Holocaust Museum, moving and sobering though that is. Not the museum. I've seen the museum, Auschwitz, in other words, what's left of the death camp. He said, I wish everyone could have 60 seconds looking at the death factory to see what their answer would be. And he said it should be on the level of a driving license or a marriage license, to see it as if as human beings we have the maturity to be able to look at evil. Now, you read the article, and I think three things would be involved in that. Realism. Can we really look evil in the white of the eye unflinchingly? Secondly, hope. Does our answer give us something that moves beyond the evil to a world that has hope in it? And thirdly, courage. At the end of the day, we've got to do something. So the trouble with a lot of the discussion of evil, why do bad things happen to good people and so on, is that they leave it on that philosophical, theoretical level, whereas the real thing is to do something, whether people need comforting or whether people need rescuing or whatever. So I think those three things should be minimal to anyone who takes Socrates' challenge seriously and wants an examined life. Realism, hope, and courage. And then go out and live it.
We'd like to thank you very much, Os Guinness. You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, recorded in March 2005, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this radio program, entitled Facing Up to Evil in the 21st Century, featuring Os Guinness, or about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Thomas Massaro. Thank you for joining us.